My favorite quotes is, "Trauma decontextualized in a person looks like personality. Trauma decontextualized in a family looks like family traits. Trauma decontextualized in a people looks like culture." This is a quote by Resmaa Menakem, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. He's an author as well as a therapist. And one of the reasons I love that so much is he's talking about what trauma might look like if it's contextualized, if it's not understood in the context of when it existed, then oftentimes what we do is we look at the behaviors now, not putting them in context of the situation in which they occurred. One of the ways that shows up, or one of the ways certainly that can happen, especially with therapists, is through diagnoses. So when somebody comes in, if they check a certain number of boxes that is dictated by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5th edition now, which is by the American Psychiatric Association, that is the sort of manual that's used to diagnose all persons, at least here in the West, we might give a diagnosis to somebody like borderline personality disorder. Now, oftentimes that disorder does find its roots in trauma, but by just slapping somebody with that label or that disorder decontextualizes, it takes it out of the context in which it really existed. So I also think that there's another meaning to this quote that I just read, which is, are there ways in which our trauma has become so infused with our identity, and in other words, the way we see ourselves, that we no longer see it as trauma? For example, when I was younger, I was often scared of my father. He was a big guy, he had a very loud, barking voice, and he could have a quick temper. Because I could never predict what might set him off, and because I didn't like being the recipient of his anger, I often would placate him, pacify him, do anything to avoid his anger being directed at me. And if it did get triggered, and he did raise his voice, then I would shut down or freeze or not say a word. And so I often wonder, is this a part of my personality that has become decontextualized as, well, this is just the way I am? And I can look at this in terms of my life and think, well, how might have this contributed to the way I am versus how might I have been something different if I go back and I actually contextualize this part of me. Now, I also think that experiences similar to that, not that experience alone, is part of what also led me into the field of therapy, to be able to help others, but I think also to be able to help myself overcome this freeze response that I had as a child. I think one of the reasons I'm drawn to the intensity of couples work is because I'm trying to overcome something that I don't always like about myself. We'll get more into that a little bit later. But today what we're going to do is we're going to open up some space and we're going to talk about how our traumas might look like parts of our personality as protectors, as well as wounds, and explore the ways they might begin to decontextualize them so that they are not so syntonic to who we are. Welcome to Trauma-Free Relationship. I'm Tom Philp, your host. And as a therapist, I've spent over 10,000 hours helping couples work through their trauma so they can repair their ruptures, heal their wounds, and communicate from a place of wholeness and connection. Let's get started. Okay, let's start with a couple of definitions because I mentioned a word there at the end of the opening that you might not be familiar with. So I want to talk about syntonic versus dystonic and what that means. Syntonic means there's a thought, feeling, or behavior, could also be a belief that aligns with the way we see ourselves. And dystonic is a thought, feeling, behavior, or belief that is not aligned with the way we see ourselves and may cause us some discomfort. Why this is important is because we're going to kind of work through today different aspects of our personality to try to understand, is this part of my personality, is this part of the way I am, and I'm using air quotes right now, is this something that was infused through trauma that has become syntonic, meaning I don't think about it as being in context of a traumatic experience? It's just kind of the way I am? Or is this something more dystonic? In other words, it's a thought, feeling, or behavior or belief that actually causes me discomfort I don't like about myself, and I am aware that it works against me sometimes. There are pros and cons to each. We can have aspects of ourself, parts of ourself, that are syntonic that actually serve us very well. We can also have parts of ourselves that are dystonic that work against us. And so we're going to kind of tease these aspects apart today and talk about these different parts that might have been, if we put them in the context, a part of trauma or an overwhelming experience, or something that maybe is just a little more hardwired, or probably actually somewhere in between. Something that might start out as traumatic can then be wired into us and look like a part of our personality. We know the whole nature versus nurture debate is actually a reciprocal dynamic, meaning that we're born with certain aspects of our personality. We're not born a blank slate that people just write onto through our experiences. We actually have some traits that we're born with that act upon the world in which we're born, but the world works and reacts upon us as well. And so our wiring and firing in our brain it goes both ways. As we act upon the world and the world acts upon us, that can rewire parts of who we are. So that's a little bit about what I'm talking about. So let's dive in for a moment. Is this trauma, or is this a part of me? So different aspects or different parts of you that might be syntonic versus dystonic, that might be, if we contextualize it, something of a traumatic or overwhelming experience, or something that is just maybe more hardwired. So for example, placating people or people pleasing. I hear a lot of patients that come in and tell me this. Well, that's my people-pleasing nature. Sometimes they say it as an aspect that they're proud of, that they know how to get along, they've got good emotional intelligence, and sometimes they speak of it in ways that works against them, that they have trouble setting boundaries or standing up for themselves. What about this one? Anger. I see this a lot in people. Well, that's just who I am. When I see dumb things go down, I get angry. Okay, but is that the only emotion you have? Does anger pop up in a variety of circumstances and interactions so that there's no other emotion being expressed? You're either fine or you're angry, pardon me. Because really, if anger is the only other emotion you're expressing, then that may be something to look at. It may be something that is dystonic, and it may be something that's actually more of a contextualized traumatic reaction based on certain beliefs that you hold about yourself or the world. What about this one? Low self-esteem. I hear people all the time, I've always struggled with this. I've always felt I didn't measure up. There are many, many times where when we pull on that string of low self-esteem here in the office, in the circumstances of their current life, oftentimes what we do is we follow that string, and it can take us back to an area of their life when they were growing up, childhood, maybe even adolescence, where we can see that they were never given the validation that they really longed for. They were never given the ability to be the twinkle in somebody else's eye, so that they knew there were people in their lives that were proud of them, not just from what they achieved, but who they were as human beings. They've never felt like they measured up because the feedback they got is that they were never enough. And so sometimes when we pull on that string and take it back and contextualize it, what we can see is this struggle with low self-esteem can actually be a traumatic response, not something that's always a part of them. And part of the way we also know that is because there can be other areas of them, other parts of them that are strong and confident and capable and that are she-bosses. They're just killing it at work. They're like this great professional that leads a whole team, but all of a sudden in their personal relationships, they never feel like they measure up. What about this one? What about depression or anxiety? That's certainly I see a lot of in patients. They come in and they've struggled with this all of their lives, this anxiety or this sense of depression. Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse, but either way, it's something that, again, if we tug on that string and trace it back a little bit, we can find sometimes some of the roots, at least, that existed in some traumatic experiences. Excessive aloneness growing up, never having a friend or somebody they could count on, abandonment by their parents, emotional abandonment, never having people that were able to be there for them in critical moments, people that were emotionally unavailable and unresponsive. Okay, what about this one? I hear this a lot, especially in my state, where we have a certain individualistic mentality, very much sort of a pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of mentality. I'm just a straight shooter. I just tell it like it is. And so a lot of times I'll hear that from people. And what that does is it masks their ability to live in any kind of ambiguity where they are not right or they are not certain about something. So they encounter situations and they just immediately shoot off their opinions because, well, that just tell it like it is. I'm just a straight shooter. Well, that is your opinion of a situation. Being a straight shooter doesn't always mean you're right. It just means you're very loud with your opinion. But sometimes being able to get people to reflect on that and say, hey, telling your spouse the way it is, and again, I'm using air quotes, the way, is basically just saying, this is the way I see it, but you leave no room for dialogue. You leave no room to open up space for anybody else's opinion. By saying that's just the way it is, or I tell it like it is saying that I get to define reality and there's no room for anybody else's definition. All right, what about this one? Non-feeling. I live in my head and I'm a problem solver and things need to just be solved. It's what I do all day long. And so I'm just not a feely kind of person. And yet I've seen many times with multiple couples that when you can get them rooted in their body long enough to feel some sense of their wound, their traumas, their pain, they become very feeling individuals. And so this idea that they're non-feeling, they only live in their head, can be traced back sometimes and contextualized as certain traumatic experiences growing up. Traumatic experiences that they were alone to solve their problems, that they couldn't depend on anybody else, or that they got recognition and they got attention when they achieved. And so they internalized that and thought, okay, this belief that I can only get attention when I achieve, and so I must be an achieving person, but that has nothing to do with my feelings or my emotions. So that's another one we can kind of look at. What about lying or cheating? I know this sounds a little bit strange. It seems like it should be very straightforward. Don't do that. And yet people that might hold a certain traumatic belief, it's a dog-eat-dog world out there. You got to do anything to survive. And if you don't eat somebody, then you'll get eaten yourself. So there's no rules beyond what benefits you. I think we can all see, as we look out into the world, people or no people that have had that mentality. And then finally, what about this one? Type A personalities. people that are sort of wound up really tight. They're always paying attention to the details. They're always working so hard to make everything just right, to make sure there are no missteps, to make sure that there are no mistakes, because the worst thing in the world is a mistake. We've all seen people like that too, and I just wonder if we tugged on that thread a little bit, if it wouldn't lead us back to a place where we can see that there was no one there to help them deal with the setbacks of life. And so what they internalized, what became syntonic to them, meaning just a part of their personality, is that they must be on the lookout at all times. They must be hyper-vigilant at all times in order to eliminate, at least as much as possible, any potential for mistakes or setbacks. So these are just a few. I think you could probably take these examples and really run with it. Probably there's many more based on your life or people that you know that you could add to this list. But now I want to turn our thoughts for a moment to what do we do about this? How do we make something that might be syntonic, meaning feeling like it's just a part of ourselves, something that's a little more dystonic, where we can get some distance and externalize it a little bit so that we can begin to understand, is this something that is traumatic? Meaning if we tug on that thread and contextualize this back to a place where maybe these characteristics might have been born out of certain traumatic experiences, or is this something that maybe is just a part of our personality? So what I want you to do is just take a deep breath if you're in a place to do this, and walk through this exercise. And you might come back to it when you are in a better place, when you're a place of more quiet or solitude, and that's perfectly fine. But I want you to identify a part of you and imagine that this is only a part. It's not the whole of you. Maybe you use one of those that we talked about earlier. Maybe it's your anger or your low self-esteem or your anxiety. And now what I want you to do is I want you to get into a space where you can get curious about this part of you. If it helps, imagine it sitting in a chair across from you. What might this part of you look like when it's activated? When that anxiety has been activated and triggered, what does that anxiety look like sitting in that chair across from you? And I want you to try to just get curious for a moment. And I want you to see if you can have any kind of feelings toward this part of you. Can you differentiate not what that part of you feels, but how some other part of you might feel towards that part of you? Is there any ways that this part of you help? Are there any ways that this part of you hurt? Actually get in your way? Are there ways that your anxiety actually make life more stressful, actually harm you by not allowing you to have any sense of peace in your own body, or that actually harm your relationships by always being so vigilant as to what your partner says or does that you can never just truly feel safe? I want you to try to ask it some questions. How did you become this way? And just see what it says to you. Usually the first thing that comes to mind is the right thing. Ask it how it feels. Ask it what it might be afraid of. What are you most afraid of? If you're not constantly on alert, if you're not constantly triggered and feeling anxious and scared, what might happen to you? What is the worst thing that would happen if you didn't exist? And just see what it says to you. Now I want you to try and imagine how you would feel or behave if this part of you was more under control. Can you see yourself differently? Can you imagine feeling differently, having different relationships, or letting go of some outdated beliefs about yourself or others? Okay, depending on what you hear back from the part that you identified, you may consider this to be some past trauma. Again, maybe you saw or a picture or a flash of something came to your mind as you were asking this part of you these questions that was traced back to an earlier trauma, or maybe not. maybe it just felt like, no, I don't know where this came from. It's just always been a part of me. And so that's okay. I would imagine this part of you has ways that it helps you, especially if it's a protective part. It probably has ways that you can see too that it might hurt you. So furthermore, if you want to work on changing this part of you because it's causing too much pain or stress in your life, you might like this part of you and you want to keep it. You may see this part of you being a great thing to have in certain contexts, but in other contexts, it actually becomes a liability. Either way, I want you to have, or hopefully you had through this exercise, a better idea of this part and when it gets activated inside of you, how it might respond. And being able to just understand this part is the first step in being able to create something that is syntonic with something that is more dystonic. And being able to get some kind of distance and see it as not the whole of who you are, but rather a part of who you are. Hey, thank you so much for listening today. As always, I really appreciate it. We're going to keep bringing these podcasts to you. You may notice that I'm not doing them every week now. I've gotten to a point where I'm getting a little bit overwhelmed and overloaded, and I want to make sure that these still provide value and have quality to them. So I might back off and do them every other week. Hopefully I can pick back up the pace here pretty soon and bring them to you weekly. But if not, you will continue to see them at least every other week. Thank you so much for listening. And until then, we'll talk to you then.
Thank you for listening to Trauma-Free Relationship, a podcast for the healing of attachment trauma. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, or our website at traumafreerelationship.com. Be sure to look for our next episode on your favorite streaming service.